Sally, and good evening, everyone. For the sixth and final State of the Rockies Project Speaker Series event of the academic year, I'm very pleased tonight to introduce U.S. Undersecretary of Natural Resources and the Environment, Harris Sherman, who will be sharing his insights on best practices for managing healthy forests in the Colorado River Basin. As many of you know, Harris is a member of the class of 1964, and we're very happy to welcome him home to campus this evening. Please join me in welcoming home Harris Sherman.
Well, good evening, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to be back at Colorado College. I also recognize there are many students here tonight who were involved in this program, and I want you to know that the original research that you're doing is incredibly helpful for those of us in public policy positions. Today, I am going to focus my comments on the Colorado River. The Colorado River obviously is of vital importance to not only Colorado, but the entire western part of the country. And I want to talk tonight about the connection of our forest to this great river and to this river basin. Because healthy forests provide a vast array of benefits. In the business I'm in, we call these ecosystem services. But it's basically a shorthand for benefits that the forests provide for a whole range of uses. And I would say first and foremost, our forests are the connection to water. I think most people in this country don't realize that half of the water that we drink in the United States comes from the national forest and public and other private forest. There are some 66 million people in America who get their water from the national forest alone. And I think in the Colorado River Basin, somewhere around 27 million people get their water from the national forest. And whether we turn on a faucet in Los Angeles or we go to the grocery store in Washington, D.C., you can rest assured that it is likely that those areas are depending indirectly on water from the Colorado River. And that water, in turn, is dependent upon how we manage these forests. So ultimately, the condition of our forest and the ability of these forests to respond to climate change, disease, development, and wildfires will help to shape the future of the Colorado River and its role as the lifeblood of the arid Southwest. Our ability to protect this incredible green infrastructure is every bit as important as our ability to build dams, canals, waste treatment plants, and other bricks and mortar types of solutions. Last year was an extraordinary year for reasons which I will show you. This is a fascinating slide. I used this slide recently when I addressed the Western governors, and we got into a very interesting discussion about this slide. This slide depicts precipitation levels in 2011 compared to the previous 116 years. So in each state, there's a number, and that number reflects the amount of precipitation, again, weighed against the previous 116 years. So if you look at Colorado, overall, last year was the 60th wettest year of 116 years in Colorado's history. But if you look at the northern tier of this slide, you will see record precipitation. There's a reason we had floods in the Mississippi and Ohio and Missouri rivers last year. There's reasons we had floods in the Columbia Basin and parts of the Colorado River Basin, because we had record precipitation or close to it in Montana, in North Dakota. And if you look at these Midwestern states extending up to the Northeast, you can see just an extraordinary amount of precipitation. Now, if you look at the southern tier, we have exactly the opposite. We have record droughts in Texas, almost record droughts in New Mexico, Oklahoma, and across the entire southern tier of the United States. Climatologists that I've talked to have said this is one of the most unusual situations they have ever seen. To have in the same year, in the northern tier, record flooding, and in the southern tier, record drought. And so far, this winter, and this shows you a slide going through December 2011, the picture has remained pretty much the same. And I was advised recently that in parts of the Colorado River Basin now, through this month, we are somewhere in the neighborhood of 35% of normal. So notwithstanding the snowstorm that Denver got a couple days ago, these precipitation patterns continue to be persistent. There have been record fires in 9 states in the last 10 years. This represents a sea change from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, where it was very rare we would have over 3 or 3.5 million acres burned by fire on public and private land. In 2000, that number jumped to 7 million acres. In 2004 and 5, it jumped to 8 million acres. In 2006 and 7, it jumped to 9 million acres. Last year, we were close to 9 million acres. And the experts that I talked to predict that this fire danger is going to exceed soon 10 million acres, and it could even go to 12 to 15 million acres, depending on how bad the drought and the climate changes continue to be. Well, why do we care about this? Well, today in other parts of the country, they are spending hundreds of millions of dollars dealing with the challenges that we have with fire and treatment cost. And this doesn't even talk about the issues we have with wildlife, with threatened and endangered species, with recreation, the aesthetic issues that come with all of this, the effect on tourism, and so forth. So fire is a major challenge. Now, another challenge that we have is the infamous bark beetle. It is clear, and I would almost frame the bark beetle issue as the perfect plague. You have a situation where there is a clear connection to climate change. Previously, in earlier decades, the winter conditions were cold, and the bark beetle was unable to survive the winter. But as the winters have warmed, the bark beetle is now propagating, surviving the winter, and then as the warmer spring conditions come, it propagates in record and now epidemic numbers. Many standing dead bark beetle trees pose a significant hazard, a health and safety hazard, to roads, to trails, to campgrounds, to recreation areas. There are literally tens of thousands of miles of these roads and trails throughout our national forest system. I asked the Forest Service to kind of estimate for me in 3 national forests in northern Colorado and southern Wyoming what that represented, just in terms of what the impact would be on a daily basis. Because these trees, if they're standing dead, will be standing for a certain period of years, maybe 10 or 15 years, and then they start to fall over. So what did that represent? Well, in these 3 national forests, of 155 national forests, the estimate was there would be 100,000 trees a day that would fall in these forests over the next decade. So when you think about that and you overlay that with these areas that have incredible recreation potential, it is a serious and a challenging problem. A recent study by the Forest Service indicates that we have somewhere between 65 to 80 million acres that need restoration. These are acres that are facing a serious potential threat of catastrophic fire. 65 to 80 million acres. So you only have to start to do the math of how expensive it would be to treat these national forests. You could do a once-over treatment and we would be spending tens of billions of dollars, perhaps hundreds of billions of dollars, to deal with a once-through treatment of these forests. And then if you add to the 65 to 80 million acres of national forest, something in the neighborhood of 325 million acres of private and state forest, you begin to appreciate the magnitude of the problem. So this is kind of an interesting slide because it puts it in perspective in the sense that we have, in this case, around 80 million acres of forests that are at risk. The pink line, red line, indicates what we would do to treat these forests through prescribed fire. That's about 3.5 to 4 million acres a year. And then that very, very thin strip that you can barely see, that's the mechanized work that we are trying to do on the forest, the work that costs $2,000, up to $2,000 an acre. So these are very expensive undertakings at a time when we don't have the resources that we used to have. Part of what we're doing is we're trying to focus on what acres are the most critical and important. This map represents a mapping exercise we do throughout the country where we try to focus on what areas are the most subject to wildfire, to soil erosion, to critical wildlife protection, and we try to zone in on which acres are most critical. So this is an area above Denver, and we will treat first and foremost those red areas instead of trying to treat the entire area. So we're focusing more on priorities of how do we move and try to protect the key areas. The photo on the right shows when we previously treated these forests. We thinned them, we removed hazardous fuels from these forests. When the fire came through, it was up in the trees. It was a crown fire. But when we did the treatment, it would drop to the ground. And when it dropped to the ground, our firefighters were able to get in and to do something about it. This is another slide of the wall of fire where it shows you at the top, the fire was coming from the top. It was a crown fire. When it got to where the two lines are, that's where we did our fuel treatment. It dropped to the ground, and we were able to protect all of those communities at the base of the mountain as a result of it. But we need to do much more work here. We've just touched the surface of these lands that need to be protected. And obviously, we need to work with counties and local governments about their zoning regulations. Counties need to think twice before permitting development in the wildland-urban interface area. In the state of Oregon, there's a river called the Willamette River, and the salmon are trying to get to their spawning beds on this river. Unfortunately, the water temperature now in these rivers is too warm. So EPA and the state of Oregon went to all of the communities and said, you're going to have to install refrigeration units in your waste treatment plants. You've got to cool the river enough so the salmon can get to their spawning grounds. Well, this was going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars. So we were able to meet with these communities and say, look, instead of putting refrigeration units in your waste treatment plants, we'll work with you to go upstream. We'll work with the farmers upstream. We will plant trees on both sides of the river. And those shade trees will cool the river more than these refrigeration plants. Well, everybody doubted us, but as we started to do the science on this and explain it, in fact, that was true, and it could be done for half the cost of refrigeration units. And this is what I'm talking about in terms of restoring green infrastructure to what we are doing, because nature often can do things better than we can. We call this sometimes payment for ecosystem services. But this is a really critical issue for the future of the Colorado River Basin. It's not going to be easy, but again, I think restoring the green infrastructure of our country will go a long way to preserving the quality of life that we have today. So I would say to the students at CEC, I hope you'll be part of this solution. We would love for you to be part of this solution. And I just want to again say I have really enjoyed my visit back here at CC, and I look forward to hearing from all of you now. So why don't we just open this up for questions? Thank you. One of the things we're doing that I find very interesting is we are working with certain corporations, more on a voluntary basis than a regulatory requirement, but corporations that are looking to offset their carbon footprint. So they will work with us, provide funding for us to go out and to start planting new forest. And the idea being to sequester the carbon that these forests perform. In other areas, particularly on private forests, there's a lot of agroforestry going on. There are certain areas of the country where there is a demand for wood, and agroforestry can be very helpful.